Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Skok, the editor-in-chief and founder of The Logic. We're just going to wait a few more seconds for people to come on. This is our usually start at around 12:31. We're going to wait another minute to get some more people in here, and then we'll get going. All right. Thank you very much for joining us and joining me this afternoon. I will confess that up until about 4 minutes ago, I thought this was a conference call by audio, not video. So what you see is what you get. This is this is the Logic home office in all of its glory. Thank you for your patience as we all work through this pandemic together. Today, we're really wanted to get this together quickly to bring in Murad Hamadi, our Ottawa reporter, to talk about the reporting that he's been doing on Palantir, and specifically a ruling that came down this week with Palantir's Canadian head, David MacNaughton. So, Murad, welcome. Thanks for joining us and for taking the time on a Friday.
I mean, there's not much going on in Ottawa on a Friday in the early fall.
So I was hoping we're going to get into it and how you did this reporting. But before we do, I kind of want to step back a little bit and ask you two questions. First, who is David MacNaughton and why is he significant? And the second one is about Palantir. But let's start with David first. Who is David MacNaughton and why is he significant?
So David MacNaughton is a long-time political operator and public servant. He's done both over the course of his time in sort of politics in both Ontario and at the federal level. He was involved with the McGuinty government, the McGuinty Liberal government in Ontario, served in very high-level staff, and if I recall correctly, also bureaucracy roles. He, in that capacity, he got to know and I believe at various points hired Katie Telford, now Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's chief of staff, Jerry Butts, the former principal secretary to the Prime Minister, when Trudeau ran, in 2015, when the Liberals were running their ultimately successful federal election campaign, he was the co-chair of the Ontario section of the campaign, along with now Innovation Minister Navdeep Bains. Subsequent to that, he was appointed Canada's ambassador to the United States, went out to Washington just as the NAFTA renegotiation. Well, I suppose he went out in the last days of the Obama administration, but his his sort of signature file during his time there was the renegotiation of NAFTA, a file in which he's been lauded by politicians and leaders of all parties, really seen as a key figure in that process. On that file, he worked closely with now Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who at the time was International Trade Minister and then Minister of Foreign Affairs, leading sort of in Washington, Canada's charge on these issues, including the sort of strategy of meeting with various senators, meeting with various governors, really putting together this full plan. He is someone who has, variously been reported on as a close advisor to the Prime Minister, someone who, has a close relationship with a lot of people in the sort of upper ranks of the current incarnation of the Liberal Party. In between his stints in government, he ran a government relations firm, I believe Strategy Corp. So he's always been in this sort of politics and business, the sort of intersection of politics and business worlds.
So he's someone who, I think to set the framing of why this story was so important, he's someone who is in the inner circle, by all accounts, of the Prime Minister. He's someone who understands how government works. And he's someone who certainly most recently was in a position in government that gave him privy to information that most people wouldn't have, being the ambassador to the United States at a very critical time.
Correct, and certainly the understanding that I have gotten from talking to various people in Ottawa is that he has, been relied on for things other than simply U.S.-Canada files. He is considered he's someone who has provided advice in sort of key areas. He during the early days of the setup of the Trudeau government, he provided advice then. After he resigned his role as ambassador, CBC reported that he was meeting with officials in Ottawa, including, I believe, with in the Prime Minister's office, to encourage the government to name his deputy in Washington as his successor, something that they ultimately did. So he certainly has had various a fairly, I think it's fair to say, influential role in the Trudeau government over the last, what's it been now, 5 years.
Okay, so that's David MacNaughton. We'll put a pin on that for a second. Now let's talk about Palantir over here. We obviously, most people, when they think of Palantir, we joke in the journalism communities about this lead that every news organization has written about Palantir for the last few years, where it's a secretive Silicon Valley firm that was funded by Peter Thiel, what does that mean?
So Palantir is a perhaps the easiest way to think about it is it's a series of data analysis tools. So companies and governments have an increasing amount of. Sorry, I think we have. Have an increasing amount of data that they're collecting on their users, on their customers, on their supply chains. All of this data that they're using to make decisions and to sort of reach outcomes, find new products. That's on the commercial side. On the government side, you have security agencies that have access to large amounts of data about people and events, about things happening on the internet, and they have to find out, and they're looking for ways to find patterns in that data. Palantir does sort of all of the above. So it is in, the business model, they've got a couple of these flagship products. They're called Gotham and Foundry, which they sell licenses to users, and then they go in, they send in people who implement that. So they take all of these data sets, some of them unstructured, that say a police force has, and they build the links between those data sources. And so some of the examples of their work, perhaps most famously in the United States, the LAPD was using their software in a project called Laser, which allowed them to basically draw links between people in their database, draw links between a person that they were investigating or who popped up as a person of interest to them, and various people associated with them in their network, family members, friends, transaction data, license plate data, and to some degree of there was some degree of sort of forecasting involved. Now that work proved particularly controversial because there was an activist group called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition that sort of laid out how this process. As I was writing about recently, after a Citizen Lab report, police databases are filled with information, these sort of suspects and arrest records and all kinds of databases of crime in the US and in Canada significantly overrepresent people of color, particularly Black and Latino people in the United States and Black and Indigenous people in Canada. If you set up a system that does this, that sort of uses that data to come up with forecasts, it can, its outcomes can be, and in the case of the LAPD, this coalition said were disproportionately affecting communities of color. And that's one set of controversial work. They've also Magente, which is a Latinx advocacy group, have also said that their Palantir software was used by ICE in detentions, arrests and detentions, something which the company has always denied. But essentially, their work is almost 50-50, corporate and government, but they're best known for their work with police forces and intelligence agencies.
And significantly, they are planning to IPO this year.
Correct. In fact, I believe later this month.
This is a company that, it's long known as a company that stayed private for a very long time, longer than most Silicon Valley companies stay private. But it's important to note that this year, next month, they are planning to go public. So that's Palantir. And we can talk about the details about Palantir and what it does and what it doesn't. But I think for the purposes of your reporting, there's the procurement piece here and what they've been doing. Before we get into the MacNaughton stuff, what Palantir has been doing strategically during the pandemic with governments around the world. They have not just been talking to the Canadian government. They've been talking to many governments.
Correct. So there's been reporting in the Wall Street Journal and the Daily Beast and a number of publications in the UK. In the US, for example, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, I can't remember what the second H is, has used their software to build essentially a program that allowed them to track various bits of their COVID response and the COVID sort of outbreak. So things like patient numbers in various parts of the US, things like supply chains, the huge sort of ventilator crisis at the beginning of the pandemic, also the PPE crisis. All of this data sort of feeds into a Palantir system, which HHS was supposed to be using to make decisions about resource allocation and how it responded to the pandemic. They've also been reported to be working in the UK, in Greece, in Germany, and a whole bunch of other places. On the call that we'll talk about in a second, I believe Mr. MacNaughton referred to 18 countries. And what they've been doing is, according to his comments and other reporting, is they've been going in and offering their services pro bono. I believe in the UK they signed, a one-bound contract, which the nominal value that they were required to, I think, just for the sake of it. But they've been going in and basically building these systems pro bono. And it has been Palantir's practice in the past, particularly with government agencies, to offer their services pro bono in the hopes of building relationships and generating business down the line. This is not an uncommon thing in the sort of tech world, but it is relatively uncommon in the Canadian context. The idea is, you go in, you help with the COVID response, you help them set up the system, and then you hope to sell more services later down the line. Okay.
I want to get into that. And there was a question I saw from Kareem Bardisi that addresses that and asks what potentially that's goodwill, right? Before we come to that question, what I want to do, I think the best thing we can do now is try to play that audio. And I'm going to use my crude technological expertise to try to get this audio done on my computer. You obtained a recording. Tell us about set this up for us. You obtained a recording of David MacNaughton back in April, was it?
I believe it was in mid-April. The story took a little while to come together, but we obtained this recording of David MacNaughton speaking on a call for customers of or clients of CIBC Capital Markets. Was it CIBC Capital Markets? It was CIBC for sure. I can't remember which variation, but in which Mr. MacNaughton was asked by the moderator of that call, former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister Lisa Raitt, who now works for CIBC, was asking some questions and asked what Palantir was doing in Canada during the pandemic. And I guess you're about to hear what he said.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to play this. Let's hope it works. Murad, you'll give me a thumbs up if you can hear it on your side. And if not, I will try again.
No. I can try playing my computer.
All right, I tried. I failed miserably. Let's keep moving on. I will say to everyone who's listening, sorry about that. If you go to our website and you look at the first story that Murad wrote, it is titled That. You will see it. There is an embedded audio clip in there that you can listen to. So Murad, Lisa Raitt asked David MacNaughton about his relationship or ties with the government during the pandemic, and MacNaughton says what?
Maybe it would be useful if I sort of read. We sort of included his remarks, obviously, in the story, but I think it might be useful to have his precise words. So sorry, bear with me. I'm just pulling up the transcript because I think it gives you a sense. So, Lisa Raitt cited these two articles that had come out in the preceding 2 days, one in the Daily Beast, one in the Wall Street Journal, about their work with various other governments, and asked, what is your technology being used to help with the pandemic here? And he said, the simple answer to that is yes. We've had some involvement with a number of the provinces and with the federal government, but I have been struck by the fact that in what is a single-payer system where the data should be more easily accessible in our system than in the US system, for instance, so much of our data and governance is siloed, that we had a heck of a time getting to the point where we can do as much as I think we should be doing to help government and leadership make decisions. And then he says that they've been working in 18 different countries around the world. Yet while we're doing a bit in Ontario, we're doing a bit in Alberta, and some in BC, and a little bit federally, I must say that I've been a bit disappointed that the Canadian healthcare system hasn't latched onto our technology as much as they could have. And then he says he thinks that might be because they've been offering their services pro bono during the pandemic.
So this kind of gets to Kareem's question. Does he have a point? I mean, isn't this goodwill? A company with great technology in the middle of a pandemic wants to help. What's the problem here? And by the way, to Kareem's question, Shopify did the same thing, offered to help as well. BlackBerry offered to help as well. What makes this one different?
I think a couple of things. And there's a Palantir thing, and then there's a David MacNaughton thing, and I think we'll do them in that order because the David MacNaughton thing gets us to yesterday. The Palantir thing is simply he's right. The data is very siloed across Canada. This has been a significant concern in the response to the pandemic. If you've ever talked to anyone who works in health tech in Canada, one of the fastest things that comes up, and I can understand why, is the extent to which provincial healthcare systems still rely on faxes to get information between hospitals and the government and so on. That's frankly ridiculous. So he is correct that the data is siloed. The issue is sort of twofold. One, at this point, when Mr. MacNaughton had this conversation, there had been no disclosure of Palantir doing any work with governments, by those governments, by Palantir. Palantir does not generally answer questions about its work in Canada. When a group of volunteers at Shopify built, what was it called? The first version of the COVID, what ultimately became the COVID Alert app, the basic source code, COVID Shield it was called. Toby Lutke, the company's CEO, first tweeted that he was putting together a group of volunteers. Then they built it. Then they offered. Then the government took it on. But like Toby tweeted through the whole process, the code was open sourced. You can go on to GitHub and see which bits of COVID Shield ended up in COVID Alert. You can see COVID Shopify employees continuing to work on COVID Alert. This just happens to be another file on which I've done a whole bunch of reporting recently, but a lot of it was done out in the open. So that's one bit of it, that there was not that disclosure. The other bit of it is that Palantir has a particular set of stories and associations that follows with it. As you said at the beginning, secretive is the word that secretive and controversial are the two words that usually go in front of Palantir's name in a lot of media stories. It's not a particularly well-known company in Canada. And when we were doing the subsequent reporting on this story, I can tell you that I had a couple of conversations with press secretaries who didn't know that David MacNaughton worked for Palantir now, and who, and I say this with, I think it's funny and illustrative. When Health Canada responded to my questions, they misspelled Palantir's name in the response. Like, it's not a name that is, well known. So there's a very heavy transparency aspect to it. But it's also that, if it is goodwill, if it is pro bono with the intention of eventually getting another contract, I think that trade-off is something that the public should know about. The government has now finally published some information about who they're procuring things like ventilator PPE from. It's very limited. I can't tell you, for example, how much CAE got for its large ventilator contract. But we know that CAE is getting some portion of these, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in ventilator contracts. A pro bono contract should be disclosed the same way that anything else is, and it wasn't.
And just so I know, it should legally, it is required to be disclosed, a pro bono contract?
That's a good question. I don't have a specific answer to, but I do. But I mean, Mr. MacNaughton's right in that the government doesn't tend to procure pro bono services, but the pro bono services have a value, and that value should be reflected somewhere. Now, the other thing that's very important to say here is that no contract happened. Palantir has not, to our knowledge, as far as has been disclosed to this point, Palantir has not been involved with the federal government's COVID-19 response. It has not been involved with the response in Ontario, BC, or Alberta. All three of those provinces, two of those three provinces, Ontario and BC, told me that there had been no discussions. Alberta said there had been some preliminary discussions, but nothing was moved forward. So in some senses, what Mr. MacNaughton said on that call seemed to jump the gun a little bit.
Well, and I see Taylor Owen had a question here, which was pointing that out, that it doesn't seem to be that there have been any contracts, even though he met with senior cabinet ministers. Why wouldn't they? Why didn't they take him up on it? Do we have any sense?
Well, I mean, I would say the beginning of this pandemic was a mess for everyone, and the rollout of various bits of technology that could have aided in the pandemic has not been. It's been, on the one hand, it's been faster than almost anything the government ever does on a regular basis. On the other hand, it has been relatively slow. So today, New Brunswick joined COVID Alert, the app. We are 7 months into the pandemic. The app itself was launched, I believe, at least 2 months ago now. So, these things take time. When at the beginning in sort of week 2, I think, of the pandemic, Minister Bains, the Innovation Minister, and Minister Anand, the Procurement Minister, basically put out an open call and said, if you have ideas for how to help us, talk to us. Here's a form. Here's how you can get in touch with us. And they received thousands of people reaching out, including, from what we understand, quite a lot of tech companies. It's entirely possible that that what Palantir was offering just didn't make sense in the context. It's possible that it got lost in the noise. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Mr. MacNaughton had, according to the release that we saw, 17 communications with various people around the government that that talked about Palantir in the context of COVID-19, and then that across three departments, and that none of that led to an outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, and just from that phone call, that conference call that we heard, or that we couldn't play, I couldn't play the audio on, but that's there's an element of frustration in his voice that, I've had these. He didn't say how many meetings he's had, but I can't get through that. Actually, he was feeling frustrated that government wasn't coming to the table.
Yeah, and the broader context of that conference call, and we chose. So I should say we got that particular excerpt from the conference call that was provided to us. We then went and verified it by accessing a replay of the entire conference call. The entire conference call is, I think it was 30 or 40 minutes. And on that call, Mr. MacNaughton said a whole bunch of other stuff that we chose not to publish because it wasn't relevant to the story at hand. But those watchers, listeners, what are they? People on this call who read the National Post opinion section on a regular basis will know that Mr. MacNaughton published an op-ed recently about the recovery, in which he talked about the opportunities presented by privatizing some assets. That's not a thing that the Trudeau government has really leaned into as institutionally. And I say this just to say that Mr. MacNaughton, has expressed in public on places like Power and Politics and in these kind of op-eds, thinking that is not strictly speaking in line with the government. So it does not, it's not necessarily out of character that he would be expressing frustration with a particular aspect of policy or decision making.
Okay, so we don't have that much time, actually. And by the way, if you have a question, please write it into the chat. I've been asking a few of them here, or picking up on a few of them. So we can kind of fast forward here. So the audio call happened. I'll just fill in the blanks here. It then became a conversation point at a committee hearing where Michelle Rempel, the Conservative, at that time shadow minister for innovation, asked Navdeep Bains about it, the Minister of Innovation. That then resulted in Charlie Angus, the NDP critic, filing two complaints, one to the ethics commissioner and another one to the lobbying.
So he filed the lobbying commissioner complaint, which resulted in Mr. MacNaughton talking to Politico about, in response to that, in which Mr. MacNaughton said that he'd not lobbied on, he was categorical that he had not lobbied on behalf of Palantir, but that he had conversations with cabinet ministers.
And we should point out, we invited Mr. MacNaughton to come on this call and talk to us, but also throughout this process, Murad, you've reached out to Palantir and to Mr. MacNaughton consistently, no response, but then he did talk to Politico once the Angus complaint happened.
Correct. I asked, I believe I asked to speak to him when we first published the story. That did not happen, and they have declined to comment. I would have to go back and check the stories individually. They have declined to comment, I believe, consistently. In this instance, they declined the opportunity for Mr. MacNaughton to be here and speak with us, and to provide a written statement that we could read out or sort of reference, citing the ongoing IPO process.
The lockup period.
Mandated quiet period.
Okay, so we get to yesterday, or 2 days ago, and the ruling. What surprised you about that ruling? I mean, these things happen often. They kind of come by the way, so nobody pays attention. What was surprising about this particular one?
Two things. One, the speed of it, frankly. Mr. Angus filed wrote his second letter to the ethics commissioner letter in, I think it was May, late May or early June. It's now September. That's fast for the ethics commissioner. The second thing that surprised me about it was the level of the sort of depth of the conversations that it reflected. So it's sort of one page of ruling that sort of summarizes the argument, and then it lists the 17 contacts. And so Mr. MacNaughton tells Politico, I am not lobbying on Palantir's behalf. I do talk to people like, I believe he named Minister Bains and former Finance Minister Morneau, and staff about issues of importance today, politics and policy, but I do not lobby for Palantir. These 17 communications are listed because they are about Palantir, at least in part. I should be clear to say that the implication is that several of them, he mentions Palantir or discusses Palantir in the context of a broader conversation, but he does mention Palantir. He is, the president of Palantir Canada. And that surprised me, the extent of it, the broad range of it, and that he was talking, it lists two ministers, Minister Bains and Minister Freeland. It lists the Chief of Defense Staff, Jonathan Vance, or I guess outgoing now. It lists the Chiefs of Staff of Minister Bains and Procurement Minister Anand. It lists the Deputy Ministers of Innovation, Procurement and Defense. That is the top rung of three different departments, one of which, Defense, is the only department with which Palantir has a disclosed contract, which is now expired. That's another one of the stories that we noticed first, we wrote first back in June last year. So that's those are important people. Those are people who are decision makers, and it strikes me as noteworthy that Mr. MacNaughton was, he said that he was not lobbying, and yet he was talking to these people about Palantir.
We have a question from Jean-Pierre Colpron, which is, do we know whether Mr. MacNaughton registered under the Lobbying Act in Canada and the nature of disclosure that he made?
He has not registered. Palantir has not registered. There's a relatively complicated reason why that might be the case, which I will spare you. So the nature of the disclosure, Palantir was clear. So I should say, actually, Palantir has responded to at least one request for comment in the case of the Ethics Commissioner, in which they said that they would cooperate fully with the investigation. The Ethics Commissioner's report suggests that was the case. This information about these 17 meetings was, from the context, it appears provided by Mr. MacNaughton to the Ethics Commissioner. But there is not a lobbyist registry. I haven't checked in a couple of weeks, but I don't think there is for Palantir that would list his contacts. It's also the case that Mr. MacNaughton, as a former designated public office holder for the purposes of the Lobbying Act, is prohibited from lobbying the government for 5 years. There's also a prohibition in the Conflict of Interest Act, so the Lobbying Commissioner side of this is unresolved thus far. The conflict of interest side of this is resolved. The conflict of interest side requires that he not have, I believe it's significant official dealings, and there's it's direct and significant official dealings, which is a sort of term of art, but or I guess a legal term, but it basically means direct contact on subjects with people, with institutions with which he, as a public office holder, like as the ambassador, would have had significant dealings in the year past. Effectively, if he had business, if the Canadian embassy in the United States or his sort of mission had dealings with Palantir that were significant and official, he wouldn't have been allowed to take the job without an exemption. And I should also say, while we're doing all of that, I should say is that he says in the Ethics Commissioner in the order confirmed that before taking the job at Palantir, he did have a conversation or a consultation with the Ethics Commissioner to approve that, or at least to notify of that job, and that was cleared.
Murad, we were talking earlier this morning ahead of the call. You raised an interesting point, which kind of poses in terms of the what's next for David MacNaughton and for Palantir. First, why does David MacNaughton take a job like this? That's kind of the big question. And the second thing is, if he can't talk to these people now for a year, all of whom these are not low-level civil servants. These are politicians and civil servants who are very senior. What does he do?
So I should say, so I think it is fair to say, and someone in in our viewership can correct me here if I'm missing something, but David MacNaughton is not a well-known technology executive. He does not have a track record of building technology companies in Canada or the United States. He is someone who has been, as the Prime Minister and the Innovation Minister have said in every response to us, a public servant. I don't think there's a lot of people that dispute that he was an effective ambassador. He has been someone who has worked with various people who are currently running the federal government. His knowledge of those institutions was cited, I believe, in the announcement that he was being appointed to this position. The year means that what does it mean that he can't have contact with these people? Well, Minister Bains said, in that committee meeting, said that he talks to Mr. MacNaughton, that Mr. MacNaughton has suggested ideas and solutions to help Canadians, that Minister Bains talks to him about his kids. The ruling doesn't say he can't have any contact with them. It says they can't have official dealings. So they can't talk about work, basically. Jacob Glick, who knows some things about the Lobbying Act, is saying, as president, he can still direct the company. I think it's silly to think that a seasoned executive leader, even without tech experience, couldn't be a business exec here. And I think that's true. As far as it goes, he ran a major GR firm. But if the job of Palantir Canada is sales and marketing, it's a sales and marketing operation, an integration operation. They set up the contracts. Then he would be overseeing that operation. We have been thus far, Palantir has received one contract from the federal government, totaling $1 million from the Defense Department for the Canadian Special Forces. That was in March 2019. That expired in March 2020. As far as we know, it hasn't been renewed.
Do we know if they have any private company contracts in Canada? Was their business in Canada disclosed in the prospectus?
It was not. They don't break that out. We do know that the Calgary Police Force uses, I believe it's Gotham, not in the same way as the LAPD used it. They use it mostly for integrating data. They don't use the sort of forecasting aspect of it. That's important to say. The security services, insofar as they disclose, and Public Safety Canada, the RCMP, have all at various points over the last 4 or 5 years denied using Palantir. But so to answer the back half of your question, we know that just like any other company selling a product, selling software, that representatives of Palantir, not Mr. MacNaughton, but other representatives of Palantir, have been having conversations with various bits of the federal government over the last year. With Treasury Board Secretariat, which handles a lot of, which is kind of like overseas IT. It's a complicated relationship with shared services, but with Transport Canada, obviously they've already had this defense contract. We know they've been doing presentations They've been showing off their software. We got some Health Canada said the Public Health Agency of Canada had talked to them about some, they built a bunch of stuff for the CDC in the States, and they had some conversations about whether they could build something similar for some kind of database that I don't quite understand what it does. Something to do with animals. It had the word zoological in there somewhere, but that they could do something here. So all of that work is still ongoing. Mr. MacNaughton doesn't have to be meeting with officials, doesn't have to be lobbying for that work to happen, for them to win contracts. Presumably that is what he will continue to do over the year of this ban. In theory, he's also not supposed to be having those contacts. So I guess actually, technically, he's finished his now, as of August, he's finished his 1 year conflict of interest prohibition on having significant and official dealings. The Prime Minister, I asked him in June, the Prime Minister said he's never talked to Mr. MacNaughton about Palantir. The PMO has never directly answered our questions about whether Mr. MacNaughton's advising them on other things, but certainly he knows more about the U.S.-Canada relationship than most people in this country. He's probably in the very upper ranks of the people who understand that relationship. His expertise, I'm sure, will be called on.
Okay, so I want to wrap it up. I'm mindful of people's time, but what are you going to be looking for in your reporting moving forward? What's the next? What's next here?
Well, I think Palantir has had an office in Ottawa for several years. Matt Braga, then at the CBC, did some of the first work on this, and we're sort of. I stand on his shoulders with a lot of this, a lot of the early work here. I think it's interesting to see how much procurement Palantir, the Canadian federal government does from Palantir in the coming years. I mean, it's hard to overstate how much work they do with the U.S. government. They in the prospectus they said they want to be the operating system of the U.S. government when it comes to data. They got a multi-billion-dollar contract to work with the U.S. Special Forces last year, and a lot of these systems are linked. Like a lot of defense and security cooperation. I can see that being an area where the Canadian government would want to buy Palantir software because that's what their counterparts in the States are doing. All of that could be completely and totally. Above board. They've also been pre-qualified to bid on government AI contracts for various departments. There's this sort of white list that's been put together, green light list. I don't know. There's a list of companies that have been signed off on. There's about 74 of them. So in theory, another government department like transport or agriculture could decide that they want to build some kind of database or data analytics solution. Palantir could bid on that and win that bid. I would be interested to see that. I would like to talk to Mr. MacNaughton about what his job entails and what he's doing in it in this country. I think he explained some of that a little bit to Politico, but I don't think he's talked about it sort of particularly robustly. I mean, between sort of August when he left his role as ambassador and I don't know, this year, Mr. MacNaughton's done a fair amount of media. He's as I say, he's an expert on the U.S.-Canada relationship. He gets asked to talk about it a lot. I would love to talk to him about that. Of course, he knows so much about it. He hasn't often been asked about what his work at Palantir entails. I think that would be. I think that's an area where if this week's events prove anything, we could do with a little more disclosure.
Great. We all are in a period where there's a lot of Zoom fatigue going on, so we're especially grateful to our listeners for sticking around and taking the time to join us. If you have any thoughts, anything else you want to share, please, by all means, email Murad or me. We always love to read it. A special thank you to Amanda Roth, Carolyn Mercer, Jenna Meisner, who produce these calls and make them as great as they are, even in spite of my own technological deficiencies. And a huge thank you to Murad for his great reporting. Murad really has owned this story, and I know I shouldn't chest thump like that, but it's been an impressive thing to watch over the last year as Murad has wrapped his arms around the complications of this company. And I suspect that's only going to continue. So we look forward to continue reading your work, Murad, and thank you again for all of your reporting so far.
It's been a lot of fun.
For all of us here at The Logic, that's it for now. We have another call coming up next week with Michelle Zaitlin from Cloudflare. I'm really excited to talk to Michelle. We'll be covering, among other things, what it's like to take a company public, and also what it's like to be running a security company in the middle of a global tech war. So please join us for that. You should have an email in your inbox and register today. That's it for now. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time today. We'll see you soon.